This lecture, part two. Caveman, such a caveman. Left hip external, left hip external. It got me to the same place. If I froze my hip and literally, it's the same place. Left hip internal, left hip internal. I'm telling you, I'm going to ask these questions, and I'm explaining why your brain might get it wrong. Left hip external. That's when we move the ball about the socket. But to get to the same place, and I move the socket has to move in opposition. Cap and bottle concept, remember? So left hip external moving the bottle is going to look like this, but when I move the cap for the same motion, it's going to look like that, because it gets me to the same place. If you're having trouble seeing it, what I suggest is, how would I go back home in the way that I'm used to seeing? Let me explain what I mean by that. If it's difficult for you to see that this is left hip external rotation, no problem. Just say, all right, my hip wasn't rotated, and now it is. How would my left hip have to rotate to go back home? Wouldn't it have to internally rotate to go back to where it started? So therefore, I had to externally rotate with the left. Do that again. Start, finish. The left hip, go back to where you started. The left hip would internally rotate. That shows me I had to externally rotate left. Let's see what the right side does. Right hip external. Right hip external. Right hip internal. Right hip internal. When we do those things together, y'all know what an arch is? So you'll see arches in the day. So left side of the wall, right side of the wall, you have an arch that comes here. That's what your pelvis is. Your pelvis is like the key bone of your arch. And you have your legs, your hips on each side, kind of creating an arch. Great for dissipating force. What we need to be able to see is how the hips rotate in opposition to help our pelvis and our trunk and movements happen. So I'm doing them one at a time, but eventually we're going to have to see that when I do something like this, we're going to name that. We're going to call that something. I'm going to teach you that next week. Right and left transverse pelvic girdle rotation. The thing I need you to see by today is that for this to happen, my right hip had to internally rotate. And my left hip had to externally rotate. For this to happen, my left hip had to internally rotate and my right hip had to externally. Show you this one. Internal rotation, left hip. Is it? I'm going to bust it up one more time. Last time. Last time, I promise. Until the next. All right, follow me. Hands on your hips. Both feet on the ground. Twist your pelvis and look to the right side of class. And I need you to keep your feet on the ground. I need you to be able to identify how your right and left hip rotated independently. And once again, your instinct is to want to say, oh, well, the right must have done this. It's not what your instinct wants to say. Can you see how when you rotate your pelvis and your hips, your toes are actually pointing on the inside? Because your right hip had internal medial rotation. Does that make sense? All right, have a seat. So, where are my where are my baseball, softball players? Okay. A lightsaber would work a lot better. What I need you to be able to tell me is if I'm a right-handed batter, I do this. That's the internal rotation of my lead foot, my lead hip. If I'm a lefty, it's internal rotation. Brain wants you to go with the cap. I need you to go with the bottle. Does that make sense? Do you see why we would want to say external? Do you see why it's internal? Okay, good. All right. What we'll do is, Grace, we'll do the last few minutes, we'll walk around, clarify if anybody wants to. I would definitely, as we add more, I wouldn't forget about ankle and subtalar. I would make it a part of the new stuff. So in other words, now we can do knee and ankle stuff. Now we can do just subtalar stuff. Now we can do knee rotation stuff. Now we can do hip rotation stuff. Wednesday we'll go over sagittal, but I want to save the frontal plane because there's some easy conceptual stuff that I can give you that doesn't involve towards or away from the midline. Practice. All right, so let's float around and we'll clarify any questions, make sure we're all on the same page.